Tragic chapter of violence is just ended. We are at the dawn of national reconciliation.
In 1967, a new country was born in West Africa. It lasted only 3 years, and by the time it ended, between 1 million and 3 million people were dead. Most of them were not killed by bullets, they were killed by hunger. This is the story of Biafra. To understand why Biafra happened, you have to go back in history, far back, before the country called Nigeria even existed. Before 1914, the land we now call Nigeria was not one country. It was hundreds of different kingdoms, different people, different languages, different religion, and different ways of life. In the north, you had the Hausa and the Fulani people, predominantly Muslim, with a long tradition of Islamic governance going back centuries. In the southwest, you had the Yoruba people with their own ancient kingdoms, the Oyo, the Ife, and the Benin kingdom. A sophisticated civilization with art, trade, and governance. And in the southeast, you had the Igbo people. The Igbo people were different from others in one very important way. The Igbo people had no kings, they had no central ruler, no single authority over all of them. Instead, every Igbo community governed itself. Decisions were made by elders, by consensus, and by the community members. This singular act will matter later, more than anyone could have predicted. Then the British came. By the late 1800s, Britain had been expanding its control across West Africa. Trading posts became colonies. Colonies became territories, and territories need to be managed. In 1914, a British officer named Frederick Lugard did something that will shape the next 100 years of history. He took the northern territories of Nigeria and the southern territories of Nigeria and merged them into one single colonial territory called Nigeria. It was named by his wife Flora Shaw. She took the words Niger, which is the river, and area, and then combined them together, giving us Nigeria. But here is the thing. The people living in this new Nigeria had not been consulted. The Hausa Fulani of the north and the Yoruba and Igbo of the south had very little in common. Different religions, different cultures, different political systems, and different economies. They were not one people, but on paper, they were now one country. To control this massive territory, Britain used a system called indirect rule. Instead of sending thousands of British officers to govern every corner of Nigeria, Britain used existing local leaders to govern on their behalf. In the north, this was easy. The Hausa Fulani already had a strong system of emirs, sultans, and chiefs who could be used to pass down British instructions. But in the southeast, among the Igbo, it was a problem. Remember, the Igbo had no kings, no central authority. So what did the British do? They had to invent one. They appointed people they call warrant chiefs. These were local men who were given official papers by the British government to act as traditional rulers over Igbo communities. But these men had no real traditional authority. The communities didn't recognize them, didn't respect them, and didn't trust them. And this created resentment, a deep lasting resentment. The British has planted a seed of conflict even without realizing it. And that resentment boiled over in 1929. in what became known as the Women's War, or the Ogu Umunwanyi in Igbo. The British had started rumors that they were going to tax women. Now, in Igbo culture, women controlled the local market. They were the backbone of trade. The idea of the British taxing their income was unacceptable. So thousands of Igbo women rose up. They marched, they protested, they surrounded the homes of the warrant chiefs and demanded their resignations. The British responded with soldiers, and at least 50 women were killed and many more were wounded. But the Women's War sent a message that will echo forward into the independence era. The Igbo people were not going to be ruled without resistance. After World War II, everything changed. Britain had spent enormous resources fighting the war, and their empire was getting weak. And across Africa and Asia, colonized people were demanding independence, and Nigeria was not different. Educated Nigerians, men like Nnamdi Azikiwe, Obafemi Awolowo, and Hamadu Bello, were organizing politically. They were building parties, writing newspapers, making speeches, and demanding self-governance. But even in this push for independence, the divisions were visible. Nnamdi Azikiwe, an Igbo man, led the NCNC party, which was popular in the southeast. Obafemi Awolowo, a Yoruba man, led the action group, dominant in the southwest. Hamadu Bello, a Hausa Fulani, led the NPC, which was controlling the north. Three major parties, three major regions, three different visions for what Nigeria should become. But they agreed on one thing, which was Britain had to go. On October 1st, 1960, Nigeria became independent. The green and white flag rose over Lagos. The crowd cheered. The world celebrated. Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, was free. Also, it seemed. Because what Britain left behind was not a united nation. It was a time bomb. The constitution Britain designed gave the North, which had more population, more seats in parliament. This meant the North will always have political dominance over the South. The Southerners, especially the Igbo, felt this was unfair. The North had been less educated under British rule because the British had agreed not to interfere with Islamic schools in the North. So while the South had more Western educated professionals like doctors, lawyers, engineers, the North had political powers. This imbalance would later tear the country apart. The first year of independence were fragile. Politicians from different regions competed bitterly for power. Elections were rigged. Census figures were manipulated because population determined political representation. Every region inflated its census numbers to gain more power. Corruption spread quickly. The oil that had been discovered in the Niger Delta, in Igbo and Ijaw land in the southeast were starting to generate revenue. But the question of who controlled that revenue was becoming dangerous. The Igbo who sat on the oil felt they deserved more from its proceeds. The North, who controlled the government, also disagreed. By 1964 and 1965, the elections had become completely chaotic. Violence broke out in the West. The Action Group Party tore itself apart. The country was heading towards a crisis. Then came January 15th, 1966. A group of young Nigeria military officers staged a coup. They called themselves the Five Majors. Most of them were Igbo. In one night, they assassinated the Prime Minister of Nigeria, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, a northerner. They killed the Premier of the northern region, Sir Hamadu Bello, the most powerful man in the north. They killed the Premier of the western region, Chief Samuel Akintola, but they did not kill the Premier of the eastern region, Dr. Michael Okpara, who was an Igbo man. They did not kill the head of the Igbo-dominated army unit. And to the north, this was not a revolution. This was an Igbo coup. This was a coup designed to eliminate northern and western leaders and hand over power to the Igbo. The anger in the north was immediate and it was volcanic. The coup plotters did not fully succeed, and power was passed to Major General Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi, the head of the Nigerian army, who was also an Igbo man. Ironsi tried to stabilize the country. In May 1966, he announced a new decree, Decree number 34. It abolished the regional structure of Nigeria and replaced it with a unified system. To the Igbos and Southerners, this seemed like progress. One Nigeria, one system. But to the North, it felt like a takeover. The regional structure had protected northern dominance. Removing it meant the more educated South, especially the Igbo, will dominate the civil service, the military, and eventually the government. Protests broke out in the north, and then the massacres began. In May and June 1966, northerners began attacking Igbo people living in the north. But remember, many Igbo had moved to northern Nigeria for work as teachers, civil servants, and traders. Suddenly, they were targets. Homes were burned, businesses were destroyed, people were dragged into the streets. Then, in July 1966, northern military officers staged a counter coup. Ironsi was captured, tortured, and killed. Power passed to Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, a northerner. But this violence against Igbos in the north did not stop. In September and October 1966, it exploded into a full-scale pogrom. Pogrom meaning that the organized mass killing of an ethnic group. Between 30,000 and 100,000 Igbo people were killed in the north. Men, women, children, killed in their homes, killed at train stations, killed trying to flee. Over 1 million Igbo survivors fled back to the eastern region, arriving with nothing. Many of them were injured. All of them were traumatized. They came home with one message: we are not safe in Nigeria. The then military governor of the eastern region was Lieutenant Odumegu Ojukwu, an Igbo man, Oxford educated, son of one of Nigeria's richest men. Ojukwu watched 1 million traumatized Igbo refugees poured into the east, and he had a decision to make. In January 1967, Nigerian military leaders met in Aburi in Ghana for a peace talk. The Aburi Accord was agreed. It proposed a loose confederation, giving each region more autonomy while remaining part of Nigeria. Ojukwu agreed. Gowon agreed. But when they returned to Nigeria, Gowon advisors convinced him not to implement the accord. They said it would break up Nigeria. Ojukwu was furious. He had brought his people to the negotiation table. He had compromised, and Nigeria had broken its word. He believed there was nothing left to negotiate. On May 30th, 1967, Ojukwu stood before a crowd of thousands of people in Enugu and declared the independent Republic of Biafra. The name came from the beat of Biafra, the body of water off the coast of the region. The new flag was red, black and green with a rising golden sun. The rising sun represented a new dawn, a new beginning, a new future for the Igbo people. The crowd erupted. People wept. People danced. People believed they were witnessing the birth of something great. But in Lagos, Gowon's response was swift. There will be no secession. Nigeria is one, and Nigeria will remain one. And he called it a police action, a quick operation to bring the rebels back in line. He said it will be over in 48 hours, but this war lasted for 30 months. In July 1967, Nigerian federal troops invaded Biafra from the north. The Biafran army was outnumbered, outgunned, and under-equipped. Nigeria had the backing of Britain and the Soviet Union, who both supplied weapons. Britain supplied arms to the federal government, officially to preserve Nigeria unity, but unofficially to protect British oil interests in the Niger Delta. Biafra fought back with whatever they had, and in the early months, they shocked everyone. In August 1967, Biafran forces launched a surprise offensive attack, sweeping through the Midwest region and advancing towards Lagos. And for a movement, it looked like Biafra might actually win this war. The federal government panicked, but the advance was stopped and federal forces regrouped. And by 1968, Nigerian troops had surrounded Biafra on all sides. What happened next was not just war. It was a deliberate starvation. Nigeria blockaded Biafra completely. No food in, no medicine was coming in, no supplies was coming in. The idea was simple. If you cannot defeat them with bullets, you starve them into surrender. Some Nigerian officials said this openly. Obafemi Awolowo, Nigeria finance minister, was reported to have said that starvation is a legitimate weapon of war. Inside Biafra, the situation became catastrophic. Farms were destroyed by fighting, supply routes were cut off, and the population was trapped. People began to starve. First the elderly, then adults, then the children that came out of Biafra in 1968 and 1969 shocked the entire world. Children with swollen stomachs, stick-thin arms and legs, empty eyes. This was kwashiorkor, a severe protein malnutrition. It happened when a child's body had no protein left. The stomach swelled with fluid, the hair turned orange and fell out, the skin cracked. These children were dying slowly, visibly, in front of cameras for the first time in history. Because Biafra was one of the first conflicts covered by television news globally. People in Britain, France, America, and Germany sat in their living rooms and watched Biafran soldiers and children dying on their television screens, and they were horrified. It is estimated that between 500,000 and 2 million people, mostly civilians, died of starvation during the Biafra War. Not from bullets, but from hunger. The images of starving Biafran children created enormous pressure on world government. France, under Charles de Gaulle, secretly supported Biafra, supplying weapons through Ivory Coast and Gabon. De Gaulle saw an opportunity to weaken British influence in Nigeria and expand French power in West Africa. The Catholic Church also supported Biafra because the Igbo were predominantly Catholic and feared Muslim northern organizations flew in secretly at night, landing on improvised airstrip in the jungle to bring food and medicine. One of those organizations was a young charity called Médecins Sans Frontières, which means Doctors Without Borders. Biafra was actually the conflict that inspired the founding of this organization. But Britain and the Soviet Union continued supplying weapons, food to Nigeria, and the United States stayed largely neutral, not wanting to destabilize a major African nation. The international community sent sympathy, but Biafra needed weapons and food, not sympathy. Through 1968 and 1969, Biafra shrank. Town by town, village by village, Nigeria federal troops advanced steadily. Biafran soldiers fought fearlessly, defending their homeland, their families, and their survival. But they were running out of everything: ammunition, food, medicine, and land. The capital, Enugu, fell in October 1967. The government moved to Umuahia. Then Umuahia failed. The government moved to Owerri. The territory of Biafra, which had once covered a large part of southeastern Nigeria, had shrunk to almost nothing. Ojukwu refused to surrender. He believed help was coming. He believed the world would not allow his people to be destroyed. But he was wrong. On January 11th, 1970, Ojukwu fled Biafra by plane to Ivory Coast. He left his deputy, Philip Effiong, in charge. 4 days later, January 15th, 1970, Philip Effiong announced Biafra's surrender. According to his words, he said, "I am convinced that a continuation of the resistance can no longer be justified. I therefore ask the Supreme Commander of the Federal Forces to order a ceasefire." Immediately after this statement, the war was over. Biafra, which had existed for 2 years, 6 months, and 16 days, ceased to exist. The rising sun flag came down. Gowon declared, "No victor, no vanquish." This statement was meant to signal reconciliation, and compared to many post-war settlements in history, Nigerians' reintegration was relatively non-punitive. Biafran soldiers were reabsorbed into the Nigerian army. There were no war crime tribunals, no mass execution of leaders. But the economic reintegration was brutal. Every Igbo person who had money in a Nigeria bank before the war received only £20, regardless of how much they had deposited. Businesses, properties, and assets that Igbo people had owned in other parts of Nigeria and had abandoned when they fled were gone. This was taken over by others. The Igbo were starting again from almost nothing, and the oil sitting underneath Igbo and Ijaw land in the Niger Delta continued to flow into the Nigeria government coffers, not into the communities above it. Ojukwu lived in exile in Ivory Coast for 13 years, and in 1982 he was pardoned by Nigeria President Shehu Shagari. This same Shagari, who 1 year later will expel Ghanaians from Nigeria. Ojukwu returned to Nigeria to a hero's welcome from millions of Igbo people. He died in 2011. And to this day, the question of Biafra had never truly gone away. Movements like IPOB, the indigenous people of Biafra, continue to agitate for Igbo self-determination. The wounds of 1967 to to 1970 are still open, still tender, and still unresolved. The Biafra War was not just a Nigeria story. It was a story about what happens when the borders drawn by colonizers force people together who were never asked if they wanted to be one. It was a story about oil, about who controls it, about who benefits from it and who dies for it. It was a story about starvation used as a weapon of war on a civilian population while the world watched. And it was a story about identity, about a people who said, we would rather build something new than remain in something that is killing us. Whether you call them rebels or freedom fighters, the children of Biafra paid the highest price, and their story deserves to be told. Their story deserves to be remembered, and this has been the story of Biafra. Thank you for watching. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe, because these stories never die.